Hello, how are you? I hope that you're having a good week and I hope that this class is coming along well for you. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 8, which is learners with emotional or behavior disorders. And to be perfectly honest with you, I think sometimes these are our students that are some of the most difficult because they really just kind of get under your skin. They learn how to push your buttons, they learn how to just turn you on a dime. And so they're really, really frustrating at times. I'm not going to lie about that. The thing is that I want to start with is students that have EBD or that are qualified for EBD are often those who are extremely struggling. There are an absorbent amount of students who have issues emotionally or behaviorally that don't qualify as EBD. So um, these students are typically the ones who have pretty extreme behaviors, and sometimes they're not like hitting and punching and violent behaviors. Sometimes they're more withdrawn behaviors, but they are the ones that can be rather frustrating because it seems that they're just sort of have a bad attitude or they're sort of a punk or I mean, I don't know, there's a whole bunch of myths or theories about them, and some of them aren't necessarily myths, but the most important thing is they're the hardest to love at times, but they're the students that need the most love, honestly. So just be careful. Don't judge too quickly and just be patient and understanding. Know that it's not you. If they get frustrated or mad, take a deep breath and say, like, I understand. I might not own this problem, or they may have overreacted to something very simple. Um, it is a disability. It is a neurological impairment in the way that they are reacting to you. And so just really when you need to take a break. Um, but try to always find something to love about that child, something to connect with them. And you're their teacher. You will have the student for the year. So as hard as they might be, you're going to have to make it through the year with that student. And so find the strengths, find that connection that you can make with them. Trust them, show them trust. And it'll be okay, really. A lot of students that have uh, EBD are totally great as long as they have somebody that they know and respect. You'll never see issues out of them, and if you do, a lot of the times, once again, it's not due to you. So really, the way that you're going to approach them is going to make or break the relationship, which will make or break the way that they are in your classroom. So just know that from the get-go before we start. It is through IDA called an emotional behavior disorder. It's somebody that's either emotionally disturbed or sometimes behaviorally disturbed. It has sort of changed to this overall EBD category. Sometimes when you look at the definition, there's really not one specific definition for a student that has an emotional behavior disorder. As you'll see on the hybrid this week, there's lots of different categories or diagnoses that might fall under EBD. So you could anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia, all sorts of things. Mental health issues are huge. But schools don't diagnose. So I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before, but schools never diagnose a disability. They're just meant to describe a disability. So they would describe a post-traumatic stress disorder as an emotional or behavior disorder because they're sort of describing the symptomalities. They're not diagnosing like this is what you have. So there's really not a precise definition of EBD, and I think that that sort of comes into play. Oftentimes EBD can overlap with other disabilities. There's not really, so all of this like imprecise or differences among models, there's not really one test that qualifies a student for EBD. It's a lot of data that is collected that shows that they have some incidences of an emotional or behavior sort of, I guess you would call it incidents again, within the school system, within the day, and you keep all this data, and if it's something that happens frequently, then a lot of times they might qualify as a student with an EBD. But like most categories, there's always some people that might disagree with the way that we're defining it. One thing that we do agree on is that the behavior is extreme, It's chronic, so it happens often. It's not just something that happens for a little bit while the mom's out of town and the mom comes back, the kid's fine. It happens consistently, and it's unacceptable, either socially or culturally even. So sometimes students act a certain way because that is acceptable within their culture, or within their neighborhood, or where they're grown up. This behavior is unacceptable, either cultural or social expectations. The federal definition, is an inability to learn not due to intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So it's an inability to learn based on the inability to maintain good relationships, inappropriate behaviors, pervasive mood or depression, physical symptoms of fear. So like, here's our anxiety, here's our bipolar, oppositional defiant disorder, or OCD. All those things sort of fall here. It does include schizophrenia. It does not include a socially maladjusted person. So some states call that a conduct disorder, but others don't. So something to keep in mind. We don't have to worry about that one too much. Okay, when we look at students with EBD, there's two types. One is externalizing and one is internalizing. And I do believe this is an open response on the quiz if you didn't get there. So what this means is just like it seems. Externalizing behavior is stuff that you will see outward. Screaming, hitting, punching, flipping of a desk, throwing things across the room. Internalizing is exactly like it seems. They get angry internally. They shut down. They don't talk to you. Things like that. So I had a student who would internalize behavior the majority of her second grade year when I had her. And she would go sit in the bathroom until literally like until it's time for lunch. And I have to be like, come on, you need to get out of the bathroom. We need to go to lunch because we had a bathroom in our classroom. Or she would sit outside the classroom and she would not come in. And so I would have to teach from the doorway. So I could see her outside of the classroom and I could see my class and I would just teach from the doorway. She very rarely spoke. If she came in off the bus in a bad mood, she would internalize that behavior, which makes it really hard because I didn't ever understand like what was frustrating her because she didn't really speak too often. But that is the two dimensions, is either they're externalizing behavior or they're internalizing. Comorbidity could mean like, so for example, I had the student who was very angry and she wouldn't talk, but eventually she would scream. So it could be a little bit of both. The other thing about morbidity is this is what we call like EBD and its friends. So it could overlap with different diagnoses. So you could have emotional behavior disorder and ADHD, or EBD and SLD. So comorbidity is just a way that means like you have coexisting conditions that are happening together. And then once again, schizophrenia also falls under EBD. Actually, 6 to 10% of school-age population has EBD, but less than 1% are identified. So sort of like last week when you talked about ADHD and less than half of the people that actually have ADHD qualify, same for this one. So there's about 5 to 9% of people that have it that aren't identified as EBD. So a very small portion of students actually will qualify for an emotional behavior disorder. Most of them is because it's that externalizing behavior. It's inappropriate and it's unbelievable when it happens in your classroom. Typically, if they're internalizing it, it's not as frustrating and it's not, you're not in such a hurry to get interventions and support in place, because if they're just quiet and they're dealing with it internally with themselves, while they might not talk to you all day, it's not disrupting your instruction, if that makes sense. So most of the people that are identified are the externals, and then boys outnumber girls about 5 to 1. The most obvious problem in children is a lack of close emotional ties. They just have a hard time really getting those connections with other people. When we look at what causes an emotional behavior disorder, it's often a couple of different things. So it could be a biological disorder or disease. This is something like bipolar, where you can't help it. It's something that is happening internally. Sometimes medication is helpful, but that's not the only intervention that's needed. Same for ADHD. A lot of times when we start people on medication, we don't also include counseling or things like that, when really we should. So if you have somebody who's dealing with emotional behavior disorders and they're on medication, they should also be receiving some sort of other intervention. Something else that could cause EBD is a pathological family relationship. So if they're living at home and they have unhealthy family relationships, that could cause them to have an emotional behavior disorder. So the parents need positive supports so that the parents can understand that their actions are influencing their children. This is sort of like, have you ever heard about how addiction is hereditary? So, if you're a child that grows up with a father who is an alcoholic, or a father who is unkind to their wives, a wife beater, you might want to say. A lot of times, the children that grow up in those environments tend to recreate that cycle when they're married because that is that's the image that they know. That's what they understand. So it happens. It's sort of very cyclical in that way, and that is something that can cause an emotional behavior disorder. Another thing is an undesirable experience at school. If something bad happened at school, and it's not addressed immediately, or it continues to happen, sort of like bullying. I know that word is sort of overused these days, but if it typically is a situation where that would happen, that could be a cause of an EBD. And then negative cultural influences is very difficult. So if you are somebody who grows up in a very unstable environment, it could definitely cause an emotional behavior disorder. To identify it, once again, those that externalize the behavior are easy to identify because we see the behaviors more often and we can keep data on, like, when I passed back a failing grade, the kid flipped his desk. When you say, when I passed back the paper, the kid didn't talk to me. Well, probably 90% of the class wasn't talking when you passed back the paper. Because it was time to be quiet in class. So you can't really keep data on somebody that's internalizing it as much as you can the one that's out externalizing the behavior. It's also difficult to identify in young children because sometimes, they go through the terrible twos or whatever you might want to say. So you don't know if it's just their age and they're trying to work through their behaviors or if they truly might have an EBD. Oftentimes there's error in teacher judgment. So here's an example for you. There was a 5th grader that I worked with that had emotional behavior disorder, and one day he was suspended, or in school suspension, I guess, because he was in the office. And I was like, hey man, what are you doing in the office today? Like, what happened? And he said, I hit this kid in the back with a pencil, and it was on accident. But I think they thought it was on purpose. So here I am in the office. So I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, math class got done and I wasn't finished quick enough, so I had to hurry up and leave. So I put my pencil inside of my book. I closed my book real quick and I was running to social studies, but I actually wasn't too late and they hadn't gone into social studies. So I ran into the kid behind me and my pencil was sticking out of my book and it hit the kid in the back. And the teacher thought I purposely poked him in the back with my pencil. And so I'm here and in school suspension. So sure enough, I go ask to see the referral for him to be suspended, and it says that he created a makeshift shiv to purposely injure a classmate. So the way that the teacher perceived what happened, by the time, clearly she was late to dismiss her class because the other class was lined up. So by the time she dismissed her class, the kid in front of my kid was being, I would assume, dramatic about the fact that he got poked in the back with a pencil. And so this kid said, so-and-so poked me in the back with a pencil and it was really hard and it hurt. And the teacher saw the pencil sticking out of the book and immediately just said, go to the office, and didn't really take time to understand the situation. And so that would be an error in teacher judgment, very much so. But this student had a negative reputation with the gen ed teachers, so I think whenever anything happened, it was much more extreme than it really needed to be, in their opinion. And sometimes there's kids who have a really difficult time at home, and they're actually okay at school. And so it's hard to identify those children, or they might be difficult at school, but they're okay at home. And so if they don't have consistent behaviors, it's hard to identify them. But judgments by teachers are important and they're taken very seriously. So before I move on, we're at the end of this 15 minutes, so I always have to pause and do the next one. So I will be back. Let me pause. Here we